Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching Today I Found Out, and in the video today, the quest for the 4-minute mile. On May 6, 1954, just under 1 year after New Zealand climber Edmund Hillary and Nepalese mountaineer Tenzing Norgay became the first humans to reach the top of Mount Everest, another seemingly insurmountable barrier was being crossed. A human being ran the mile in less than 4 minutes. The man who did it was the 25-year-old British medical student Roger Bannister, finishing with a time of 3 minutes 59.4 seconds. This not only set the cheering fans into hysterics, but it shook the world of track and field. At the time, the previous record of 4 minutes 1.4 seconds, set by Sweden's Gunter Haag, had stood for 9 years, despite a considerable number of attempts to break it. This ultimately resulted in somewhat outlandish speculation by various contemporary sports writers that finishing under 4 minutes in the mile was simply physiologically impossible for a human, a notion the runners themselves actually thought absurd. As one of Bannister's chief competitors in the quest for the 4-minute mile, John Landy, noted, it was simply a barrier in terms of conditioning by runners at that time, the track conditions, and the competition. That said, he did note that the 4-minute mile had become the Mount Everest of track and field. While the Olympic quest to go faster, higher, and stronger has long driven athletes to do just that, the Olympics themselves have never been a place to break the 4-minute mile, as this event goes by meter distances. The closest event in the Games, the 1,500 meter, is only 93.3% of the full 1,609.4 meter equivalent of a mile. However, it was the 1952 Olympics in Helsinki that Bannister and his two chief rivals, American Santee and the aforementioned Australian John Landy, suffered defeats humiliating enough to seek redemption through chasing the mark. Bannister was a man who took pride in his own training methods, with theories on everything from oxygen consumption to evenness of splits. He also did manage to maintain a balance between running and the rest of his life. However, Bannister was planning on dropping running after the 1952 Games to focus on his chosen career as a physician. But when he finished fourth in Helsinki, he invoked the wrath of the British press, who scapegoated his independent-minded training ideas as the reason the Brits did so poorly in the track events. Feeling he had something to prove, the medical student changed his mind and doubled down on running. Another runner at the 1952 Olympics, Australian John Landy, left the track in disappointment after failing to qualify for the finals. However, Landy left the meet with a dose of inspiration from the era's dominant distance runner, the Czech locomotive Emil Zatopek. Zatopek won gold at those games in the 5,000 meter, 10,000 meter, and the marathon. One of Landy's teammates ran 3 miles to the closed-off Soviet Olympic village and slipped past the guards just to seek counsel with Zatopek. Regaled with stories from his teammate, Landy joined the entourage of admirers that followed Zatopek around as he warmed up and pontificated about his running regimen. What he learned from Zatopek wasn't running style and form, but that the key to success in running was rigorous year-round training to build up endurance. This is something that's exceedingly obvious to anyone today, but at the time it went very contrary to the popular idea that you should train as little as possible when not gearing up for a race, even taking many months off at a time. The idea behind this is that it would stop too much stress being put on the body. Zatopek, on the other hand, advocated continual intense interval training and felt the more you stressed the body, the better, so long as you let it heal up sufficiently between training sessions. Using Zatopek's training methods, within a few months of the 1952 Games, Landy managed the fastest mile time since Gunter Haag set the record at 4 minutes 1 second 0.4 in 1945. Landy's new personal best was 4 minutes 2.1 seconds, cutting 9 seconds off his best time from before he changed his training routine. Shortly after this, on January 3rd, 1953, he managed a pace of under 4 minutes on the mile until the final 20 seconds, in which he ran out of gas, slowing considerably and finishing at 4 minutes 2.8 seconds. Santee, a University of Kansas sophomore who had been breaking American records left and right, had an even bigger chip on his shoulder. The Amateur Athletic Union, AAU, was the bane of his existence throughout his career, primarily concerning that he continually drew truly massive crowds at the races he competed in, but was not allowed to earn any money from it. This was something that the poor Kansas boy wasn't shy about railing against publicly, making him many enemies within the AAU. In this first run-in with the AAU, however, the trouble was not about amateur athlete exploitation, but in the AAU denying him entry into his best race, the 1,500 meter, at the 1952 Olympic Games. So what was their reason for this? Well, he had already qualified in the 5K for the Olympics, and they didn't think he could perform well in either if he competed in both. To keep him from running at the 1,500-meter Olympic trials, two AAU officials physically pulled him off the starting line mere moments before the race. Shortly before the games, as something of a middle finger to the AAU, Santee raced the American 1,500-meter entrants Bill Ashenfelter and Warren Drulzer in a three-quarter-mile 1,207-meter competition and effortlessly defeated them both. At the games themselves, Santee was alienated from the team over his conflict with the AAU and was given little support from them for the race. To make matters worse, his college coach had not been able to make the trip, leaving him on his own to vainly try to strategize a race where he didn't really know much of anything about any of the other competitors. The result was one of his worst 5K times as an adult, ultimately finishing 13th at the games. Track and Field News stated that Santee inexplicably ran the 5K at the games like a novice. After the Olympics, Neil Bascombe noted in his book The Perfect Mile, Santee wanted to prove what a big mistake it had been to prevent him from running in the 1,500 meter, and more importantly, he wanted to show how good he really was. He set his sights on a goal that had always been on the horizon for him, the 4-minute mile. Although Santee and Landy were not the first to break the 4-minute mile barrier, it was the relentless improvement of their personal bests that pushed Bannister and his support team to break the mark sooner than later, out of fear that one of those two would conquer the Mount Everest of track and field first. In the months leading up to the record-breaking race, despite Santee competing exceptionally frequently compared to Landy and Bannister, sometimes even racing multiple times in a single day in various events and frequently racing several times a week, he had nonetheless reduced his personal best time in the mile to 4 minutes 2.4 seconds. At this point, he hoped to make his big push for the sub-4-minute mile after the college season ended that year, and he could properly rest for such a push. As for Landy, he had managed a personal best of 4 minutes 2 seconds in the mile, and several more times in the 4-minute 2-second range in early 1954. With Santee nearly getting there despite his rigorous race schedule, and Landy coming so close so many times, Bannister, whose personal best at the time matched Landy's at 4 minutes and 2 seconds, knew that if he were to be first, he'd have to pass the mark soon. In the lead up to the fateful race, Bannister took 5 days off running, though he did do some light hiking. When the run started, he later stated, "I can remember feeling so full of running that on the first lap I called out to Chris Brasher, 'Faster!' In fact, he did 57 seconds. There was nothing wrong with the pace." After the second lap, Chris Chataway took over pacing from Brasher and continued through about the halfway point of the last lap. As Chataway tired and began to slow, Bannister unlocked my finishing burst and sprinted past him to the finish line. "I leapt at the tape like a man taking his last spring to save himself from the chasm that threatens to engulf him." He later stated, "I felt like an exploded flashlight with no will to live." As the crowd and Bannister anxiously waited for his time to be read, the stadium announcer, Norris McWhirter, finally spoke, dragging the suspense out as long as possible. "Ladies and gentlemen, here is the result of Event 9, the 1 mile. First, number 41, R.G. Bannister, Amateur Athletic Association and formerly of Exeter and Merton Colleges, Oxford, with a time which is a new meeting and track record, and which, subject to ratification, will be a new English native, British national, all-comers European, British Empire and world record." The time was 3, but at that point the roar of the crowd drowned out the rest of the digits. His time was 3 minutes and 59.4 seconds. A mere month later, Wes Santee would break the record in the 1,500 meter with a time of 3 minutes 42.8 seconds, then for good measure continued running in an attempt to become the second person to cross the 4-minute mile barrier. He failed though, with a time of 4 minutes 0.6 seconds. Less than a year later, peaking at 4 minutes 0.5 seconds for the mile and holding 3 of the 5 fastest mile times in the world at that point, he was temporarily banned by the Amateur Athletic Union, AAU, for accepting money to race. According to the AAU, he had been given at least $1,200, which is about $10,000 today, to cover his expenses for travel, food, and lodging in 3 races in May of 1955. At the time, the AAU only allowed the organizers of their races to give $15 per race to the athletes, despite crowds that sometimes swelled into the tens of thousands who were paying only to watch Santee run. Later, questions about Santee's amateur status likewise saw him permanently banned from AAU events and international competition. Because there was no professional running organization at the time, after finishing up his tour with the Mariners shortly after being banned, where he at least could still compete in their running events, he never competed again, his personal best missing the 4-minute mile mark by half a second. Santee later bitterly noted of this, "The AAU says it is possible to get by on the expenses allowed permitted by their rules. My answer to that is yes, if you want to become an athletic bum." He also mused about the fact that it was AAU officials who were the promoters who commonly offered extra money to the best runners to come and race at their events, including stating that the then head of the AAU, Dan Farris, had once paid him to race. He quipped of this, "I always questioned how they could be the ones giving me the money and on the other hand, banning me for it." As for Landy, just over 2 weeks after Santee's 4-minute 0.6-second attempt at a sub-4-minute mile and 46 days after Bannister's successful one, John Landy would not just cross the 4-minute mile barrier, but shatter Bannister's world record by 1.7 seconds, managing a time of 3 minutes 57.9 seconds, which was officially rounded by the AAF to 3 minutes 58 seconds on June 21st, 1954. On August 7th of that same year, Landy and Bannister would go head-to-head at the 1954 British Empire and Commonwealth Games in Vancouver, British Columbia. This was one of the most anticipated races of the day. In it, for the first time in history, 2 competitors both managed a sub-4-minute mile, with Landy finishing at 3 minutes 59.6 seconds and Bannister at 3 minutes 58.8. Landy led until the last bend before he decided to turn and look over his left shoulder to see where Bannister was, an opportunity Bannister used to sneak past him on the other side. Notably, about 7 months later, Landy ran an incredible race of 4 minutes and 2 seconds. So why is this number impressive? Well, that's because it included him stopping completely mid-race after he accidentally spiked Ron Clark on the arm when Clark tripped and fell in front of him. Rather than continue running, Landy stopped to make sure that Clark was alright, helped him up, and apologized for accidentally stepping on him with his spiked shoes. Once back on his feet, Clark urged Landy to continue the race, which he did. The total time Landy was standing still was about 7 seconds. He finished with the aforementioned time of 4 minutes and 2 seconds, meaning he likely would have shattered his own world record of 3 minutes and 58 seconds had he not stopped. This is not unlike the time an Olympic rower stopped to let some ducks swim by and still won the gold medal, as we've covered in a previous video. After their respective racing careers were over, Bannister would be knighted and enjoyed a distinguished career as a neurologist, his research in the latter, according to him, being his proudest achievement, not the sub-4-minute mile. Landy would pursue a successful career in business before becoming governor of the state of Victoria in Australia. Santee would go on to own an insurance agency in Kansas, as well as give regular running clinics to high school and college athletes. And if you're wondering, today the current mile record is 3 minutes 43.13 seconds, held by Morocco's Hachim El Guerro. He set this record in 1999 and also holds 7 of the 10 fastest times for the mile in history. Since then, no one has come close to surpassing that mark. As for the so-called metric mile of 1,500 meters, that record has stood at 3 minutes and 26 seconds since 1998, and it's held by the same guy. So I really hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please do hit that subscribe button below. We put out brand new videos every day of the week. Also, let me thank our patrons on Patreon. If you are interested in supporting this show and helping us keep making these daily videos, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. We've got some great perks lined up for people who do. So please check that out at patreon.com/TodayIFoundOut, or check out the link in the description below. And as always, thank you for watching.